These perceptions come too late. At the instant, I was only conscious that what would have been a pleasure was now a hopeless toil. There was no occasion to make much moan about this state of affairs. I had ceased to be a writer of tolerably poor tales and essays, and had become a tolerably good surveyor of the customs. That was all. But, nevertheless, it is anything but agreeable to be haunted by a suspicion that one's intellect is dwindling away or exhaling without your consciousness, like ether out of a phial, so that at every glance you find a smaller and less volatile residuum of the fact that there could be no doubt, and, examining myself and others, I was led to conclusions, in reference to the effect of public office on the character, not very favourable to the mode of life in question. In some other form, perhaps, I may hereafter develop these effects. Suffice it here to say that a custom-house officer of long continuance can hardly be a very praiseworthy or respectable personage, for many reasons. One of them, the tenure by which he holds his situation, and another, the very nature of his business, which, though, I trust, an honest one, is of such a sort that he does not share in the united effort of mankind. An effect which I believe to be observable more or less in every individual who has occupied the position is that, while he leans on the mighty arm of the Republic, his own proper strength departs from him. He loses, in an extent proportioned to the weakness or force of his original nature, the capability of self-support. If he possesses an unusual share of native energy, or the enervating magic of the place do not operate too long upon him, his forfeited powers may be redeemable. The ejected officer, fortunate in the unkindly shove that sends him forth betimes to struggle amid a struggling world, may return to himself and become all that he has ever been. But this seldom happens. He usually keeps his ground just long enough for his own ruin, and is then thrust out, with sinews all unstrung, to totter along the difficult footpath of life as he best may. Conscious of this infirmity, that his tempered steel and elasticity are gone, he forever afterwards looks wistfully about him in quest of support external to himself. His pervading and continual hope, a hallucination which, in the face of all discouragement, and making light of impossibilities, haunts him while he lives, and, I fancy, like the convulsive throes of the cholera, torments him for a brief space after death, is that finally, and in no long time, by some happy coincidence of circumstance, he shall be restored to office. This faith, more than anything else, steals the pith and availability out of whatever enterprise he may dream of undertaking. Why should he toil and moil, and be at so much trouble to pick himself up out of the mud, when, in a little while hence, the strong arm of his uncle will raise and support him? Why should he work for his living here, or go to dig gold in California, when he is so soon to be made happy, at monthly intervals, with a little pile of glittering coin out of his uncle's pocket? It is sadly curious to observe how slight a taste of office suffices to infect a poor fellow with a singular disease. Uncle Sam's gold, meaning no respect to the worthy old gentleman, has, in this respect, a quality of enchantment, like that of the devil's wages. Whoever touches it should look well to himself, or he may find the bargain to go hard against him, involving, if not his soul, yet many of its better attributes, its sturdy force, its courage and constancy, its truth, its self-reliance, and all that gives the emphasis to manly character. Here was a fine prospect in the distance. Not that the surveyor brought the lesson home to himself, or admitted that he could be so utterly undone, either by continuance in office or ejectment. Yet my reflections were not the most comfortable. I began to grow melancholy and restless, continually prying into my mind to discover which of its poor properties were gone, and what degree of detriment had already accrued to the remainder. I endeavored to calculate how much longer I could stay in the custom-house, and yet go forth a man. To confess the truth, it was my greatest apprehension, as it would never be a measure of policy to turn out so quiet an individual as myself, and it being hardly in the nature of public officer to resign. It was my chief trouble, therefore, that I was likely to grow grey and decrepit in the surveyorship, and become much such another animal as the old inspector. Might it not, if the tedious lap of official life that lay before me finally be with me as it was this venerable friend, to make the dinner hour the nucleus of the day, and to spend the rest of it, as an old dog spends it, asleep in the sunshine or in the shade? A dreary look forward this, for a man who felt to be the best definition of happiness to live throughout the whole range of his faculties and sensibilities. But all this while I was giving myself very unnecessary alarm. Providence had mediated better things for me than I could possibly imagine for myself. A remarkable event of the third year of my surveyorship, to adopt the tone of P.P., was the election of General Taylor to the presidency. It is essential, in order to form a complete estimate of the advantages of official life, to view the incumbent at the incoming of a hostile administration. His position is then one of the most singularly irksome, and, in every contingency, disagreeable, that a wretched mortal can possibly occupy, with seldom an alternative of good on either hand, although what presents itself to him at the worst event may very probably be the best. But it is a strange experience to a man of pride and sensibility to know that his interests are within the control of individuals who neither love nor understand him, and by whom, since one or the other must needs happen, he would rather be injured than obliged. Strange, too, for one who has kept his calmness throughout the contest, to observe the bloodthirstiness that is developed in the hour of triumph, and to be conscious that he is himself among its objects. There are few uglier traits of human nature than this tendency, which I now witnessed in men no worse than their neighbors, to grow cruel merely because they possess the power of inflicting harm. If the guillotine, as applied to office holders, were a literal fact instead of one of the most apt of metaphors, it is my sincere belief that the active members of the victorious party were sufficiently excited to have chopped off all our heads, and thanked heaven for the opportunity. It appears to me, who have been a calm and curious observer, as well in victory as in defeat, that this fierce and bitter spirit of malice and revenge has never distinguished the many triumphs of my own party as it now did that of the Whigs. The Democrats take the offices, as a general rule, because they need them, and because the practice of many years has made it the law of political warfare, which, unless a different system can be proclaimed, it were weakness and cowardice to murmur at. But the long habit of victory has made them generous. They know how to spare when they see occasion, and when they strike, the axe may be sharp indeed, but its edge is seldom poisoned with ill will, nor is it their custom ignominiously to kick the head which they have just struck off. In short, unpleasant as was my predicament, at best I saw much reason to congratulate myself that I was on the losing side rather than the triumphant one. If, heretofore, I had been none of the warmest of partisans, I began now, at this season of peril and adversity, to be pretty acutely sensible with which party my predilections lay, nor was it without something like regret and shame that, according to a reasonable calculation of chances, I saw my own prospect of retaining office to be better than those of my democratic brethren. But who can see an inch into the futurity beyond his nose? My own head was first that fell. The moment when a man's head drops off is seldom or never, I am inclined to think, precisely the most agreeable of his life. Nevertheless, like the greater part of our misfortunes, even so a serious contingency brings its remedy and consolation with it, if the sufferer will but make the best, rather than the worst, of the accident which has befallen him. In my particular case, the consolatory topics were close at hand, and, indeed, had suggested themselves to my meditations a considerable time before it was requisite to use them. In view of my previous weariness of office and vague thoughts of resignation, my fortune somewhat resembled that of a person who should entertain an idea of committing suicide, and, although beyond his hopes, meet with the good hap to be murdered. In the custom house, as before in the old manse, I had spent 3 years, a term long enough to rest a weary brain, long enough to break off old intellectual habits, and make room for new ones, long enough, and too long, to have lived in an unnatural state, doing what was really of no advantage nor delight to any human being, and withholding myself from toil that would, at least, have stilled an unquiet impulse in me. Then, moreover, as regards his unceremonious ejectment, the late surveyor was not altogether ill pleased to be recognized by the Whigs as an enemy, since his inactivity in political affairs, his tendency to roam at will in that broad and quiet field where all mankind may meet, rather than confine himself to those narrow paths where brethren of the same household must diverge from one another, had sometimes made it questionable with his brother Democrats whether he was a friend. Now, after he had won the crown of martyrdom, though with no longer a head to wear on it, the point might be looked upon as settled. Finally, little heroic as he was, it seemed more decorous to be overthrown in the downfall of the party with which he had been content to stand, than to remain a forlorn survivor when so many worthier men were falling, and at last, after subsisting for 4 years on the mercy of a hostile administration, to be compelled then to define his position anew, and claim the yet more humiliating mercy of a friendly one.